While the world's attention is focused on the fallout from last week's Oval Office showdown, the fate of Europe is being decided in other places as well, like Slovakia, a country now situated on the political front lines between the European Union and a growing Russian influence. So, will Bratislava become Moscow's advocate in Brussels? Join me to find out here on Wider View. And I'm your host, Mateusz Mazzini. Good evening. For our main story tonight, we are coming back to Europe. But this week, we will explore the political reality far from the spotlight of the corridors of Brussels, Berlin, or Paris. Although nearly every country on the continent has undergone major shifts in recent years, hardly anyone has expressed as many bouts of turbulence as Slovakia. A murder of a renowned investigative journalist and his partner, a corruption scandal rocking the country's political class, an attempted assassination of its prime minister, and then his mysterious disappearance and a trip to visit Vladimir Putin in Moscow. All of that in the span of just few years in a country with a population of no more than 5.5 million. Not long ago, Slovakians split from their Czech neighbors and then joined both NATO and the European Union. Will the westward stance of Slovakian politics be abandoned now? We look for answers in our report.
The Slovak Republic in its current form dates back to January 1st, 1993, when the so-called Velvet Divorce officially came into effect. Through an entirely peaceful process, Czechoslovakia was dissolved. Two countries emerged in its place, with capitals in Prague and Bratislava. In the years to come, Bratislava was a rather minor player in European politics, and Slovakia continued to be perceived mostly through a prism of the entire region. For both Brussels and Washington, it was fundamental to anchor all the Visegrad countries in Western institutions. Slovakia accomplished that mission in 2004, a year of a double accession to NATO and the EU. But domestically, it has not been free from major turbulence. Among the most controversial political figures was Vladimir Mečiar, the former prime minister and acting president. He was seen by many as one of Europe's first populist leaders, pushing the country away from liberal democracy. When the dust settled after his term in office, the country faced another challenge. In 2018, Ján Kuciak, Slovakia's leading investigative journalist, was assassinated in his own home, together with his partner, Martina Kušnírova. Kuciak was investigating a tax fraud scheme tying major Slovakian businessmen and prominent political figures. The investigation into his death is still ongoing, with many suspecting it was ordered from the very top of the country's elite. In May 2024, Slovakia took another hit with the attempted assassination of Prime Minister Robert Fico. He survived the attack and recovered, remaining one of the most controversial figures in European politics, known for his skepticism of the EU's support for Ukraine. Some of the members of his party, Smer, have even entertained the idea of Slovakia leaving the bloc altogether. At the same time, Russian influence in Slovakia's information ecosystem is growing by the day. Given the seriousness of the current geopolitical shifts, it remains unclear which way Slovakia will turn in the coming years.
Are pundits right to call Robert Fico a pro-Russian politician? Will Slovakia sabotage EU's unity on Ukraine? And what does the Prime Minister stand to benefit from a trip to Moscow? No one knows answers to these questions better than first-hand observers. So let's give them a warm welcome. Joining me tonight on Wider View are Grigorij Mesežnikov, President of the Institute of Public Affairs in Bratislava, and Pavol Demeš, Senior Transatlantic Fellow at the German Marshall Fund in the United States. Good evening, gentlemen, and welcome to Wider View.
Good evening.
Pavol, let's open up with you in a fundamental, inasmuch as a simple question. Is it a correct assessment to label Robert Fico, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, as a pro-Russian politician?
I think until end of last year, I would sort of say that this is probably not correct, that he has some sympathies, but last steps of Robert Fico and his party members, namely a visit by his deputy Luboš Blaha to Moscow, then surprise visit by Robert Fico himself before Christmas to meet Vladimir Putin in Kremlin, then following by other deputies from the parliament who went to Moscow. And last but not least, Robert Fico also announced that he is going to attend 80th anniversary of end of World War II in Moscow. So I think that if you combine these steps with some of his announcements and positions vis-a-vis ending the war in Ukraine, I think that one could say that Robert Fico has quite a deep sympathy towards Russia. And I think that it is connected also with his domestic problems, what he has, and trying to get pro-Russian sentiment into the political landscape, because he is losing many things which made him in his first 3 terms in office popular. By far, one can say that he is no more social democrat, but Grigorij Mesežnikov, who is political scientist, I think that he can give more in this classification. But in nutshell, I think that Robert Fico is more pro-Russian than pro-European Union these days, because he's accusing even EU that we are for war and he's for peace.
So all that matters is what's happening right now. And since you, Grigorij, have been put on the spot already, I'm going to move our discussion over to you and ask you about the other part of this equation, which is Ukraine and Robert Fico's politics in Ukraine. But before I do that, I'm going to read out a quote from Robert Fico himself, precisely about EU stance on Ukraine. Very openly, I declared today that Slovakia will not belong among those countries that will support Ukraine militarily. That is a statement made by Robert Fico on the 26th of October last year during a European Council meeting. We have heard the difference between military and humanitarian help that he projects. Why is that?
Well, I think that this question is related with your previous question to my dear friend and colleague Pavol Demeš, whether Robert Fico is or not pro-Russian politician. I agree that especially in the last period of time, he is more open in his sympathies to Russia, to Russian regime. But I have to say that years and years before, he criticized many countries, he criticized many organizations, European Union, NATO, individual member states, but he never criticized Russia. He never criticized Vladimir Putin. And I think that because of some personal experience, but also because of the treatment and attitude to neighboring countries in comparison with other countries, Robert Fico simply dislikes Ukraine. I don't want to say maybe he even hates, but years and years he expressed his low level of trust to Ukraine, and especially after Russian aggression, when Ukraine started to win in some moments of year 2022, when Robert Fico was opposition politician, he started to criticize our government, previous government, for supporting Ukraine. I just would like to remind that previous Slovak governments, 2 governments of Eduard Heger, it was party political government, and then shortly functioning so-called bureaucratic or technocratic government, they supported full-scale Ukraine, economically, politically, in humanitarian area, militarily. But Robert Fico started to criticize the government and at the same time Ukraine. And he is quite consistent in this position. When he became prime minister, immediately he stopped military support to Ukraine. And humanitarian aid is something different, because we have, according to official statistics, we have 130,000 Ukrainian refugees, mostly women. So not to provide them by humanitarian support would be really inhuman and immoral. So Robert Fico is keeping here the main line concerning the humanitarian situation, but really, especially in the last weeks after Donald Trump changed US position in this war. Robert Fico openly, inclined.
I'm gonna interrupt you here, Grigorij, and jump on this straight away. Even though it seems that humanitarian help to Ukrainians is being used by Robert Fico as window dressing, which is, for all intents and purposes, might be a new low in European politics. But let's bring this discussion, still with you, Grigorij, up to speed. We have an emergency EU summit coming up this Thursday. We have just heard European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announcing the mobilization of additional 800 billion euros for a rearmament of Europe and also support for Ukraine. What is Slovakia going to do during that summit in Brussels?
Well, we know this from Robert Fico's statements. He now conditions the agreement with the approval of this package of support for Ukraine by European insistence to Ukraine and pressure to Ukraine to allow gas deliverance, Russian gas deliverance to Slovakia through Ukrainian territory. Otherwise, Robert Fico is threatening not to support. So in his statement, he somehow predicted that if Slovakia's demands will not be met or fulfilled, then, Slovakia can complicate the situation in this European Council decision.
So on that note, I want to come back to you, Pavol, and ask sort of a methodological question. How does Fico position himself vis-a-vis other European politics? Because he seems to be an odd player. He's not a right-wing populist nationalist like Orban. He's not a liberal Democrat like Emmanuel Macron or Donald Tusk here in Poland. Who are his closest allies in Europe and why?
I think that we need to remind ourselves that this is fourth term for Robert Fico as Prime Minister. In his first three terms, he was clear social democrat. His deputies in European Parliament were members of a socialist group. Nowadays, his deputies in European Parliament are independent. Socialists would never admit them because of their position both domestically and internationally. Robert Fico, in order to maintain power, which is relatively weak these days in comparison, for example, with Viktor Orban, he started to shift completely from his previous standing and position as social democrat, and he's conservative populist. He just a week ago or so attended even conservative summit in Washington, where Donald Trump greeted him. And Robert Fico's rhetoric at that summit was very close to Donald Trump's vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis Ukraine. So I think that his position before upcoming summit of EU 27 leaders in Brussels this week, I think that in spite of his threats, what he declared yesterday during his press meeting here in Bratislava, I think that he is always at the end of the day voting together with EU 27, similar like foreign minister who last week was voting for 16th package, sanction package. So I think that Robert Fico is before every summit these days playing this game that he is very different from those in EU. Because he wants peace and they are war thirsty and so on. And the only
I'm going to interrupt you a little bit because for what I gather, that very much looks like a contradiction. On the one hand, he claims himself to be the pro-peace agent within the European Union, but that makes him all the more likely to be an ally of Viktor Orban. We have seen the letter that Orban has sent to European Council President Antonio Costa accusing the European Union on warmongering. So where is the difference now between the likes of Orban and Robert Fico, if you could, Pavol?
Yeah, I think that they are duo. I think that the only real friend and ally of Robert Fico these days is Viktor Orban. In 1.5 years since he came to power and created this three-member coalition government, there was only Viktor Orban among prime ministers who visited Bratislava. Even Donald Tusk have never visited officially Bratislava, or Robert Fico during his visits of neighboring countries after he assumed premiership, he hasn't visited Poland. So for that reason, I think that we can say that Robert Fico's the only ally friend with whom he shares genuinely both domestic style politics, but also position vis-à-vis EU, vis-à-vis Ukraine and Russia. It is Viktor Orbán only. All others, I think, are having rather different position.
So, final question in that segment, still with you, Pavol, since we're talking about Hungary. We see right now on the screen the ethnic makeup of the Slovakian nation. As many as 7.7% of the inhabitants of the Republic of Slovakia define themselves as Hungarians. That is quite a significant percentage. Does that play a role in both domestic politics of Slovakia and also the bilateral relations between Orbán and Fico, that Slovakia encompasses such a statistically significant part of the Hungarian population?
I think that traditionally Hungarian minority had political representation in parliament. They have several political parties, but they are so fragmented that they have no deputies in Slovak parliament. And I think that they are rather vulnerable when it comes to elections, because they are watching Hungarian TV channels. And also before elections, usually Robert Fico together with Viktor Orbán are playing some games with them in order to get sympathy. But nowadays, I think that in bilateral relations, both Hungarian minority in Slovakia and not such a sizable but small Slovak minority in Hungary are not causing any frictions, problems, and so on. So I don't think that Hungarian minority element these days is something which would be shaping mainstream Slovak politics.
That's at least a very straightforward question. One less thing that we have to worry about. Grigorij, back to you. And another frank question. Given everything that we have discussed so far, we know Robert Fico traveled to Moscow to see Vladimir Putin. What is the upside for him of such a trip? What does he stand to benefit from cuddling up to Vladimir Putin, especially right here, right now?
Well, it's a good question, but really I do not have answer to this question, plausible answer, because we can just speculate. First, I think that Robert Fico, because of his longer-lasting sympathies to Russia, to Kremlin, to Vladimir Putin, probably he satisfied his intent to be closer to Putin. So it means it's something psychological.
So it's personal. Is that the hypothesis here? That is actually a personal element of
just my
politics?
Hypothesis, because there are no any economic benefits from being ally of Russia. Russia is insignificant even in our trade, foreign trade. Russia as a partner, it's aggressive country. It's a country which is trying to disunite European Union, to disrupt our democratic system, to disrupt coherence of our society. Russia consider us as a hostile country. What Robert Fico would expect from cooperation of Slovakia with Russia. So I think that there are some personal factors, personal elements behind of this visit and behind of the considerations about normalization of relations between Slovakia and Russia. I can mention one statistical data. We have here in our country 47 billion of foreign investment from European Union. 47, and only 70 million euro from Russia. Nothing. 600 less, investment from Russia. Russia is not giving us any support. Unlike European Union during our membership since 2004 gave us more than 30 billion euros. So it means that we are integrated part of European Union. We can easily survive without Russia. Of course, having good relations with the normal but not aggressive country.
So, Pavol, moving a little further away from Europe now, I wanted to ask about another very curious bilateral relationship being developed in Bratislava right now, the relationship between Slovakia and China. But before I ask my question, I'm going to let Prime Minister Robert Fico talk about the links between Bratislava and Beijing himself.
The incredible transformation that China has achieved in such a short time deeply impressed me. We gather today to celebrate the 75th anniversary of diplomatic relations between our nations. This milestone represents years of friendship and mutual understanding. Our countries have built pragmatic relations based on mutual respect and shared interests.
So we've heard his statement from a state visit in Beijing last year. Why the efforts to get closer to China right here, right now?
We need to look at government manifesto first, and then second, overall developments in last year. In government manifesto, Robert Fico's government says that top priority and strategic interest is membership of Slovakia in EU and NATO, then Visegrad Group, and then discovery of new territories in Asia, Latin America, and others. In nutshell, he started now foreign policy in all four vectors: north, south, east, and west. And this four-vector policy is repeated again and again. And this visit to China last year, he labeled that this was most significant foreign visit he made throughout whole year. And he established strategic partnership with China. He took largest ever delegation of governmental and business people going to China. And one of the big things in Slovakia is car producing country. Is that deal was made and strengthened that this year in spring, new electric car batteries will be produced here. So for him, he wants to show that EU is not the only territory where he would like to do business. He wants to show that he is exploring countries like China. He went also to Brazil. So diversification of Slovakia's economic interest is the main motive, what he's explaining to his voters and people around. And just to add small thing to Russia, vis-a-vis Visegrad 4 group, which for Poles, this is not so easy to understand, positive sentiment for Russia is the highest, and vulnerability of Slovakia towards Russia hybrid warfare and manipulation is the highest. We almost 3 years ago, we expelled 35 Russian diplomats from Bratislava because of their job which they did, which was not in accordance with diplomatic norms and rules.
Gentlemen, very quickly, because we have very little time left, a question to both of you in one or two sentences. Some of the deputies of Smer Robert Fico's party are already mentioning a possibility of Slovakia leaving the European Union, or at least making that up for discussion. Is this a likely scenario? First Pavol and then Grigorij.
I don't think that this is a likely scenario. Recently, all three top leaders, President, Prime Minister, Speaker of the Parliament, made public declaration that this is not their intention at all. But people are worried, and that is why we have series of massive protests across the whole country.
I'm going to put a full stop here and move over to Grigorij. What's your take on that?
Well, I think that it was very disturbing statement. Also, I think that it's not very likely a variant of development, but it indicates, what kind of discussions are held inside party Smer. So it means that they are working with such scenarios, which is really very disturbing.
I guess this is all we have time for tonight. In the moment in which Europe craves stability, it very much seems to be the case that Slovakia is not going to contribute to that cause. And on the contrary, the battle for the political soil of Slovakia is still, it seems, undecided. Grigorij Mesežnikov and Pavol Demeš were our guests tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
The landscape of global politics seems tumultuous right now. That's because it is pure chaos for the most part. But the Slovakian case study offers a valuable lesson that every consensus, even over benefits stemming from a Western-oriented policy course, can be, in fact, eroded. Nothing should be taken for granted in Europe. Not now, not ever. And that, sadly, is not a hyperbole. Thank you for being with us tonight. Next week, we will take a closer look at another European player, Italy, aspiring to be a bridge between Brussels and Washington. Make sure you're with us next Wednesday, follow us on YouTube, and have a good evening.